Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos webinar featuring a brand effectiveness analysis of both presidential candidates, brand Biden versus brand Trump. Today's presentation will be given by Chris Murphy and Chris Jackson, and you can read more about them on the slide in front of you. Throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, please submit your questions online using the Q&A feature. Time permitting, we'll answer questions at the end of today's session. However, if time runs short, then your question will be answered by email. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be directly emailed to you. Okay, so now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Chris Murphy, Global Head of Brand and Strategic Research. Chris, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much, Ellen, and thanks everybody for being with us today. So as you saw in the invitation for this webinar, what we've done here is take our brand success framework that we use to assess commercial brands and actually applied those same tools and KPIs to the presidential candidates as if they were commercial brands. So we're looking for scores on how they perform on meeting voter expectations and shaping voter expectations, the degree to which they do so in a relative context, and the degree to which they do that with empathy. So in terms of the timing of our survey, this was from February of this year. With in excess of 1,000 Americans. So one of the big things that we found here that's a little bit different from the commercial brand world is that when we look at the relative importance of expectations, context, empathy, here we see they're almost evenly distributed across the three. So defining expectations is, what people think and know about a brand, and defining context as knowing what's going on in people's lives and the world around them, and then defining empathy as a brand's ability to understand what's really important to people and then empathize accordingly. You can see that the weights are relatively evenly distributed there. And in this case, context is a bit lower than we often see in the commercial brand world. And empathy is over 2 times when we assess commercial brands. Now, that can make some sense given that we're talking about individuals, but let's go a lot deeper into each of those at this point.
And the one thing I would just add is this isn't the first time we've done this. We actually did this in the 2020 election as well, and that will come back in a few minutes as an important point. So it's a very interesting longitudinal study now.
Yeah, and we'll show you how the drivers of brand selection have changed in 4 years' time, and it's quite a lot. And Chris, thanks for the setup. So as we talk about expectations, let's start by having a look at how close people feel to the two major candidates here. So if we go back and compare to 2020, in that time period, Joe Biden was getting 28% of American citizens saying, yeah, I feel really close to this guy. These days, it's down to 11. So a 17-point drop in about a 3.5-year period. Now, if we look at Trump, back then he was at a 32, and now he's all the way down to a 16. So he's got a closeness advantage over Biden in the here and now, but these dips are just precipitous. And we actually went on to our brand database and looked at all the commercial brands that we've assessed in the same time period to see if there was any commercial brand that had dropped quite as violently as these two brands have dropped on the measure of closeness. And as you can imagine, being Ipsos, we have thousands and thousands of brands in our database. Not one dropped to quite this degree. Chris, kind of your thoughts on why perhaps this has happened.
Well, I mean, remember from September 2020 to now, a lot of things have happened in the world. The 2020 election happened, the pandemic, which actually was still relatively early in September 2020 in the grand scheme of things, killed 1 million Americans. The January 6th events happened. And then, Biden, when he did finally assume office, presided over sort of a lingering COVID recovery that never really fully felt like we were out from underneath the virus, and surging inflation over the last 2 years, which I think we'll see in a number of places is really damaging Biden's standing with the American public.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. If we move on, then one of the other questions that we asked was, hey, given this list of politicians, who's your favorite? Keep in mind, we did this in February, right? And so you see that 27% of the population named Donald as their favorite. Only 16 said Biden. And then third place was very interesting, especially given he hasn't declared any type of candidacy, right? Bernie Sanders at 11%, and still skewing very heavily to younger citizens. So Bernie's still on people's mind, even if he's not going to be on the ballot. And then you see this 24% on the far right that would say none of these. Even when we try to get them to pick a favorite, a quarter of the population resisted this.
Yeah, and if you add up the blue bars and the red bars, it actually equals about the same number overall, but you can just see how Trump's solidified Republican support in a way that Biden just does not enjoy. Biden has a much more fractured base between sort of his more moderate institutional side and Sanders' more liberal, anti-institutional group in a way that Trump does not have to deal with.
And then there's this question. I would vote for my candidate even if they were in jail. Now, I don't think a lot of Democrats are expecting Joe to be in jail at the time of the election, but again, only 4%. But isn't it interesting that even in February, once a lot of the trials had already begun, 45% of Republicans said, "Yeah, I'm going to vote for this guy." Pretty much no matter what. And Chris, I think this aligns to some other polling we've done on the same
That's
issue.
right. Ipsos actually just yesterday released new polling with Reuters on some of these questions around Trump's legal challenges. And we see similar levels overall. And I think the way to interpret this number isn't necessarily that Republicans are more than happy to elect a felon. It's that this particular Republican candidate is seen as being under siege by an institutional system that's against him, and they actually question the legitimacy of the charges in the first place. So even if he was convicted, a significant number of them, of Republican supporters of Trump, believe that it wouldn't be a righteous or a rightful conviction, and yes, they would continue to support him no matter what.
All right. So we're starting to get kind of a feel for the intensity of support that goes Trump's way here. Now, when we just look at a very broad definition of supporters, and here we're just looking at people who say, okay, either this person would be my first choice or someone I would consider, you can say things start to even up a little bit here. So Trump has a very slight advantage, but now we've got 30% who say, I would not support either candidate. And I know the term double hater has gotten some play in the press of late, and to a degree we're picking that up here. Chris, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this 34 to 35 split is pretty similar to what we see in a lot of the polling, the head-to-head election polling. It's a very close election. I think it becomes an environment where these sort of double haters can potentially, even if only a small number of them end up voting, could sway the results of the election because it's such a tight battle between the bases on either side. So, just 1 or 2% of these don't support either candidate if they decide, you know what, I'm going to vote Trump because I think he's going to do good in the economy, or I'm going to vote Biden because I think Trump's a threat to democracy. that might make the difference, right? So understanding sort of how the push and pull works is really important to understanding the ultimate trajectory of the election this year.
And we will speak directly to the theme of push and pull in just a little while. We've got a neat driver slide that shows what pulls people to Trump and what pushes people away from him, and same for Joe. Wanted to show a few data points that we've titled Older and Bolder. When we start to look at the positive traits that Biden's supporters associate with him and the positive traits that Trump supporters associate with Donald, we see the word bold show up in a big way for brand Trump. And on the issue of qualifications, it's roughly equivalent. And ditto for intelligence. Donald's supporters might call him out a bit more there. So Trump is definitely carrying the bolder designation. Now for the rhyme scheme, when we start to look at some of the negative traits that are naturally associated with Biden by his own supporters, 87% of Biden supporters would say, yeah, we see him as old. And isn't this interesting when you compare it to the other side of the slide? Because Donald's not that much younger, right, than Joe, and yet only 38% of his supporters kind of call out the word old as a defining trait compared to the 87% in Joe's own camp. And the 24% that perceive Trump as reckless, I'm going to ask you to comment on that one, Chris, because it might not be an altogether negative thing for some of those folks. But it is interesting, virtually nobody sees the Donald as boring, right? But even 25% of Biden's supporters are bored by him. So Chris, your interpretation of this reckless metric.
Yeah, so I think this slide really shows, again, the strength of Trump's base and his connection to his base, because you can see, each of this Biden supporters and Trump supporters evaluation of their candidates, and you can just see how strong Trump's are. And that reckless number might not necessarily be a bad thing for Republican voters, because remember, they are in many ways looking for someone who's going to shake things up. So a certain amount of devil may care attitude may actually be appealing. Though on the same thing, I think boring is also not necessarily a bad thing. Part of why Biden won the 2020 election was the sort of promise to make things boring again, make it okay to ignore politics again, right? And he's not been able to deliver on that, but that was part of his appeal originally. But you can see the downside of that in that he's not perceived as bold, certainly compared to Trump. He is boring.
So yeah, I guess make politics boring again won't quite fit on a baseball cap.
Not as catchy.
but not a bad strategy. All right, let's keep rolling. So this is a very important slide. And what we've done here is ask people if Biden were elected, which of these three statements best describes things for you, right? So this would be a good thing for a person like me, wouldn't really impact someone like me, or that would be a bad thing for someone like me. And they're colored with the requisite green light, red light, yellow, kind of coding there. But what you see at first glance here, and also keep in mind, now we're looking at total population, right? So we're not just looking at supporters. Biden is perceived or expected to deliver good things by only 21% of the population. Trump, on the other hand, is coming in at 36%. Now, his is a much more polarizing profile because, as you can see in the middle there, only 14% of U.S. citizens would say, it's not going to have any impact on me either way. So people have strong feelings in either direction. And then the other thing that I thought was so interesting here, that 45 and that 47 in red off to the right, that's really close. And when we did some driver analytics back in 2020, we saw there were a number of things, kind of fear factors, if you will, that were pushing people away from Trump and towards Biden. We see less of that in this cycle. And it's very interesting to see that kind of the negative consequence crowd is similarly sized for both of these guys. And Chris, your take on this one would be great.
Yeah, no, and I think it's important to remember that the people who say a bad thing for Biden are most likely saying a good thing under Trump, right? So it's not like there's probably some number who say bad for both, but in some ways these two charts are actually mirror images of each other. And one of the big takeaways is among that big group of people who think Trump's election is a bad thing, they don't think Biden's election is a good thing necessarily. They at best think it's neutral, right? And again, this is part of Biden's struggle, is to convince the public, particularly the anti-Trump public, that he is a positive alternative rather than just not Trump, right? Because Trump's not the president. He's not as scary as he might have been in 2020. And it's just a harder argument to make, at least as of, February this year. Maybe a couple of months from now it might be different. But that's the challenge that Biden's really facing.
Chris, do you think the 36% kind of positivity score for a Trump win, do you think that equates or predicts in any way turnout?
I don't yet, because fear is a strong motivator of turnout. It is, the classic turnout motivators are fear and love. And Trump is both of those, right? He is beloved and he is feared. So he's going to be driving turnout. I think the question is which one ends up being stronger. I think our data this year suggests that the fear is not quite as strong as it was in 2020, though again, we are still 7 months out from the election.
Very good. Thanks, Chris. All right. Now, we just showed you the data for the US. We're going to shift gears here for just a moment into a different study. Ipsos does a study called Essentials, which is a monthly kind of dip on topics of the day across the world. And so we look at 15 of the world's largest countries. And we asked a really similar question last month, which was, if Trump wins the US presidential election, is that a good thing for your country? You feel you will be unimpacted, or is that a bad thing for your country? And you can see there's a lot more green space in the United States than there is in a lot of other places. But now the red starts to overtake the green, right? Compared to the last slide. So Germany, Canada, Mexico, South Korea, France, the UK, those negativity numbers are 2, 3, even 4 times larger, than people who would say that would have a positive impact on me. So with the exception of China, I think on the global stage, it's fair to say that a Trump victory might be more poorly received than even here in the United States. And then we do a little exercise called brand mental networks, where we let people free associate a little bit in terms of the words that they just naturally associate with the candidates. And given how polarizing Trump is, we wanted to show you some of the things that came up a fair amount. And it's kind of captured here on the positive side. Trump is somebody who will say what everyone wants to say, but won't. So he's giving voice to a lot of unspoken concerns out there. He's seen as a fighter who won't back down. He's seen as patriotic, and by some as bringing some common sense to the equation. On the negative side, some of these are pretty harsh feedback. But yeah, we have egotistical moron, a cancer, a malignant narcissist. That's just quite a quote. And stuck at the age of 4. Chris, I don't know if there's any color commentary necessary.
No, I just think this is a great example of the strong feelings that Trump engenders. And we do actually have data for Biden on this as well. And the thing that sort of jumps out on Biden, both positive and negative, is old, and it's just, I think it's testament to how Biden is just not as motivating as Trump is in either direction. And even though Biden is the incumbent president, this election still is really kind of about Donald Trump.
And I think as deeply as we might want to probe our database of brand mental network exercises, this is probably the only time we've ever seen the term malignant narcissist show up. So there we go. So I think the bottom line on the expectations part of our brand framework would say, look, expectations for both brands are quite low. Remember those closeness scores that had dropped by more than half in just 3 years' time. I think relatively speaking, in the USA, there are more positive expectations attached to a Trump win than to a Biden win. But internationally, the prospect of a Trump win carries a lot more negative expectations. And we talked a little bit about double haters before in terms of people who say they would not support either candidate. There's another way of looking at that, which is to go into that same closeness variable and look at all the people who are on the far negative end and not feeling close to either guy. And in that case, we were looking at over 40% of our sample that said, I don't feel close to either one of these. And just for fun, we said, all right, what if we looked at the positive side of that coin? Is there anybody who actually likes both of them or feels close to both of them and might actually struggle with their vote? And of the over 1,000 people in our sample, there were only 7. So you got 430 versus 7 in terms of double haters and double lovers, if you will. So it does paint a certain portrait of where we are right now as a country. So moving from expectations to context. Some of you are familiar with I believe this next quote came from 1992, right? This is James Carville advising the Clinton campaign. That's where the great quote, "It's the economy, stupid," kind of came from. I think the way we're looking at things now, we might say it's the context, stupid. And I know our own Cliff Young did a really neat interview recently where he talked about how important things like extremism have become, maybe even more important than the economy right now in terms of driving voter selection, as well as immigration. So we're going to unpack some of these contextual matters for you at this point. Starting with just kind of the American outlook right now is pretty bleak. When we ask people, hey, do you think your life's going to be better 5 years from now than it is today? You can see that number in the mid-30s, it's the same for Democrats, Republicans, Independents. And that's a pretty sobering figure. And we also see when we ask a more near-term version of that question in other surveys, you see that this notion that next year is going to be better than this year, that's also kind of on the trend decline. So just keep in mind as we show you this next set of data, that's the general temperament of the country. So with that in mind, let's have a look at some of the issues that are associated with the candidates. So Biden is going to be much more likely to be associated with abortion rights, environmental protection, inclusivity, and prioritizing the public health, whereas Trump is going to be much more likely to be associated with prioritizing Americans who were born here. You can see that that's quite a figure, that 56, keep in mind that's a national figure, not just his supporters, right? So 56% say, yeah, he would prioritize Americans who were born here. He's also seen as being more likely to fight woke extremism, to really understand who our true enemies are and to fight elite corruption. And we'll come back to that notion of the elites here in just a moment. Chris, anything to add on this one?
No, I think it does speak to how the two men are viewed vastly differently. And one other piece of context is that Americans are broadly speaking anti-system. They think that the system is broken. So again, to that elite piece, one of Biden's challenges is that he's basically a system guy. He's been in Washington virtually his entire life as an elected official. So it's hard for him to position himself as an outsider, whereas Trump, even though he is a former president, still is able to enjoy some of that.
Mm-hmm. Great point. So let's go kind of issue by issue here for a moment. Obviously context matters, right? And we showed you earlier that it drives about a third of one's decision here. So let's have a look at immigration, right? So, a much more kind of hot button issue with Republicans than Democrats, right? So 70% of Republicans will agree with the statement that there are too many immigrants in this country. Only 24% of Democrats would agree with that, and you can see that independents are kind of in the middle. But then if we look at how the candidates are associated with this attribute prioritizes Americans that were born here. If I look at supporters of Biden and Trump, and that's what's going on the left side of the blue, and then I look at total population on the right side, that's what was going on in that column. You can see that amongst his supporters, 86% believe that Trump would prioritize Americans that were born here. Given that 70% feel that there are too many immigrants in the country, obviously, Trump is seizing upon a very hot button issue with them, and has been since he declared his candidacy back in 2016. Biden is not seen by many of his supporters as prioritizing people born here. And then, as we mentioned before, even when we take this out to total sample, you've got over half that associate Trump with prioritizing native-born Americans.
And this is a particularly strong version, a way of asking the question, but even if we ask it in a more generic fashion, just who's better on immigration with no sort of additional detail, Trump still leads Biden by 20 percentage points among all Americans and the forced choice matchup on the issue. So yes, on this particular framing, Trump's lead is huge, but even in a very generic framing, Trump has a considerable lead on the issue of immigration.
So next, contextual matter. Let's talk a little bit about MAGA and the American dream, right? And in a ways, I almost titled this slide "Glory Days." So you look at the percent of people who would agree with this statement. I would like this country to be the way it used to be. 79% of Republicans are kind of expressing this longing for the past or of the bygone era. Only 31% of Democrats would agree with the same statements. And once again, independents are kind of straddling the middle. But almost 80% saying, yeah, I'd like things to be the way they used to be. So when we look at the attribute safeguards the American dream, quite interesting to see, Trump doing quite well amongst his supporters, again, knowing this is a really hot item, with Republicans, and garnering very positive associations with safeguarding that kind of American dream, that historical American dream. And then even when we take that out to total population, so we're not just looking at supporters anymore, Trump is seen by more Americans as kind of safeguarding that dream. So Chris, I think this is a fascinating one.
Yeah, and this I think speaks to, you would assume that a candidate's supporters would say their candidate safeguards the American dream. It's sort of one of those like elementary items. And Biden, a third of his supporters, right, people who say they'd vote for him or pick him as their candidate, don't say that he's best on safeguarding the American dream. I think they're more likely to say neither candidate would. And that's really most of that difference in the total number between Biden and Trump is Biden's poor performance with his own supporters. And I think much like the earlier question we showed on the future of America and who would have a positive impact, many of Biden's supporters don't necessarily think he's going to have the best showing protecting the American dream going forward. And again, that's one of his fundamental weaknesses in the election this year.
And then one more context issue, the question of the working class hero. So if you look at this statement, the economy is rigged in behavior or in favor of the wealthy. Now, almost 80% of Democrats would agree with that. Half of Republicans. Maybe if we'd said, election ballot boxes are rigged, we would have gotten a different response. But this is about the economy. You got a vast majority of Democrats agreeing with this, right? But then if we go over and have a look at this, this attribute stands up for working class people. This one is really interesting, right? So if you look amongst supporters of Biden, 74% say he would stand up for the working class. And that's a good number. But the Trump figure at 85, that's really something, especially considering that I think Joe has gone to some lengths historically to kind of position his brand as the working class person's candidate. And then even when we look at total population, Trump has a slight lead on this, which is very interesting when somebody's trying to kind of declare a positioning space like that, and your competitor is beating you on it. even though it's a really hot ticket item with your constituency. So, Chris, any other notes on this one?
No, I just think, again, this shows just the strength of Trump's connection to his base, because Biden is the first president to ever join a picket line for a labor union that was on strike. Never happened before, and yet Trump still actually edges him out on this measure for a number of different reasons, but fundamentally because of Trump's connection to his base.
And we're going to talk about that connection a lot more in just a moment. So one final context note, we do have a lot of people, probably on this call too, who feel like things are a bit out of control right now. So both parties seem to be able to agree on that, 2/3 in one, almost 90% in the other, that things feel out of control right now. So we had a look at a couple of variables on how well they thought the candidates could collaborate and how competent they were or kind of fit for office. So if we can expose the right side. There it is. So if we look at people's perception of, a candidate is willing to work with the other side, I see Biden does quite well there, and with his supporters. Now, this may be a good thing, this may be a bad thing, I don't know, but for Trump supporters, they do not see him as particularly willing to work with the other side. And when we take that out nationally, only 19% of the population says, Trump would be able to work with the other side of the aisle. And so Joe has almost got a 2-to-1 advantage there. In terms of competence to do the job amongst the supporters, again, Trump gets that really strong score, again, representing that strong tie to the base that Chris was talking about before, and so much so that he carries a national advantage on that as well. So the bottom line, I think, on context is, Trump is generally perceived as prioritizing issues that are most important to the people who he has targeted and are currently supporting him. So edge to Trump on contextual variables. And with that, we'll move to empathy. And how well each of these candidate brands has mastered kind of the art of empathy and connecting with their base. So before we show you any data, we're not going to do a formal poll here or anything, but just think about this, because we asked this question for Nikki Haley too, back when she was in the race. Which of these three candidates do you think would score the highest on empathy? In other places where I've done polling on this, I'll say it's come back roughly a third in terms of the vote count. But what we actually see here, the winner is not Nikki Haley. The winner is not Joe Biden, but it is indeed Donald Trump. And if you think about the way he's gone about his brand building business, he has chosen and understood a tightly defined target market. Not trying to appeal to everyone, but a narrowly defined target. He has made that target feel like they have a voice, and he's made that target feel valued. So we'll show you the data behind some of this now. So if we move on, keep in mind as we're sharing this with you that almost 2/3 of Americans feel forgotten by politicians, and that's not just unique to it's more pronounced among lower to middle income Republicans, but it is pretty much across the board. So when it comes to politician citizen empathy, there's a real gap there, and I think we're going to show you some things that show that Trump has done a pretty good job seizing on that gap. So if we look at some of these perceptions on empathetic variables for the candidates across their supporters, you see that Trump has a much higher score on giving voice to my concerns, on defending my values, on recognizing the values of Americans like me and aligning with my values. Not that Biden's doing a terrible job, but you can see Trump has a pretty strong advantage, with his base here. Hence the title, I hear you, I get you, and I'm with you. Chris, your observations on that?
No, I think that this is, it speaks to, again, just what we've seen over and over again, that Trump has this closer connection to his supporters and that it's been sustained. And I think at this point, you have to sort of speak to how media has worked in the election and how sort of the existence of a conservative media ecosystem has helped keep Trump close to his base in a way that Biden does not enjoy. The mainstream or traditional media is not pro-Biden, it's pro-conflict, right? It's pro-drama. Pro whatever sells, versus conservative media, which is also pro whatever sells, but is also very pro-Trump. So you have very differential results where Biden has this very sort of tepid support across all of these sort of core attributes, and Trump does not.
Makes total sense. Thanks, Chris. So if we keep going, this is the driver analysis that I promised you earlier, and we're going to show you how things come out now in 2024 compared to how things looked 4 years ago. And in a lot of ways, the fundamental question here is, are you on the side of the system? And by that, we mean preserving democracy, or are you on the side of the people? So the way this is arranged does require a little bit of explanation. What we've done here is categorize the variables that we would say are positives for Biden, that are pulling people towards him. There's another set of variables that are pushing people away from Trump, so negatives about Donald that push them towards brand Biden. Then there are negatives about Joe that push them towards the Trump camp. And then lastly, there are attributes that are pull variables for Trump, or positive things about him that attract the base. And the size of those boxes are not accidental. So the relative importance in our model is actually captured by the size of the color fields that you're seeing. So building on some of the points that we've already made, you can see some of the more powerful drivers that are pulling people towards brand Trump are defending my values, giving voice to my concerns, recognizing the value of people like me, understanding who our enemies are and getting things done and being competent, and strengthening the American reputation. So a lot of positives associated with Donald. If I go to the other end of the continuum, Biden, he is seen as qualified by his supporters, but some real strength around upholding democracy, right, and respecting law and order. And that one's so interesting because just 4 years ago, respecting law and order was actually in the Trump camp. So that has changed quite a lot, maybe for obvious reason. But then you can see some of the push variables around racism, corruption, et cetera, kind of going both ways. But now let's go back and look at 2024, and I'll open it up to Chris's comments. It's a different deal, right? So you see the size of that light blue field, the push from Trump towards Biden. It used to be a lot bigger, right? And now it's really narrowed. And the bright red, the attraction elements towards Trump, those have gotten bigger. So we are seeing brand Trump, maybe even more so than it did in 2020, kind of commanding the brand selection kind of topography. So Chris, your observations on 2020 versus 2024.
Yeah, I think these two slides are super interesting and super important to understand, because a lot of what Biden's campaign has been built on is this fear of Trump. But what the data here suggests is that fear just is not as strong as it was 4 years ago. And it makes it sort of an open question of, is that a winning strategy if you're building on this much smaller push group that isn't anything like the size, it's half as important as it was in the last election? And is that going to be enough to counteract Biden's relatively minimal pull and the relatively strong pull for Trump? I think that's what we're going to have to see over the course of the next couple of months as the campaigns unfold.
Thanks, Chris. So if we kind of wrap this up on the empathy piece, this is a quote from a Trump supporter in Kentucky. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and a few weeks ago, Trump came here and addressed a affiliation of religious organizations, and After he had done that, they were interviewing some of the attendees, and this was one of the quotes that came out. Trump is just one of us, really. He's a billionaire, but he's one of us. So it's very interesting that he's been able to kind of command, that sort of perceptual space, that's very strong empathy with his core base, even though economically speaking, they have absolutely nothing in common. And if we go to the next and kind of wrap up the bottom line on empathy, this is another area where, at least as of now, Trump does have an advantage. His supporters feel heard, they feel valued, and the Biden brand, on the other hand, is more associated with upholding the system, preserving democracy, and that probably is his strongest playing card moving forward. But yes, it might not be what you expected when you came onto this call to hear brand Trump associated so strongly with the word empathy, but that is where we are.
Yeah, and the thing I would just add to end is thinking about this from the perspective of brands. They are raising obscene amounts of money to run advertising through the course of this year, hundreds of millions of dollars, plus what is done in the news media, and like a single day's worth of coverage on a cable news outlet is the equivalent of millions and millions and millions of dollars. So I think part of what we're seeing here is the legacy of continually pretty positive coverage of Donald Trump and Fox News, conservative-leaning news outlet, which is again worth about roughly maybe the equivalent of $15 million worth of advertisement in his behalf every day. And of course, not every day he's been covered, but really since the trials and indictments and trials against him started last year, he's been the main character on most days. And, you sort of, again, think of it in terms of how you would manage a brand. If you're pushing that much advertising underneath your brand, of course you're going to be strong. And the Biden campaign has nothing like that level of positive coverage in the like MSNBC or CNN, both of which are actually smaller ratings than Fox as well. Nor have they really launched their own advertising campaigns very much, though again, Biden is amassing a pretty sizable war chest, and he is just starting to roll out some of his advertising. So that's why I keep mentioning that we have to watch this as it unfolds over the course of the election. What is the impact of this advertising and this marketing? Is it going to change how these brands are perceived? Because ultimately, that's what this game is going to be about. Are the campaigns going to be able to build up the strength of each of these candidates as their brands?
So to wrap this up with some closing thoughts here, I think the key takeaways, let's remember that both of these brands are much weaker than they were back in 2020 in terms of the percentage of people who feel close to them, right? Brand Biden is disproportionately associated with upholding democracy. Trump is obviously standing for his supporters and gives them a voice and gives them hope for prosperity. And again, is perceived at this stage as the more empathetic, given how he's been able to cultivate those perceptions amongst his target audience. And as Chris has described quite well, Brand Biden does face quite a positivity dilemma, going forward. Really needs to work on associating more positive expectations with his brand. If you remember that 36 to 21 slide, I'm sure his camp would like to raise that 21 quite a lot here over the next 6 months.
And I think with that, we have a few minutes. We can take questions. If anyone has any, you can use the GoToWebinar application, use the Q&A field to type in any questions, and Chris Murphy and I would be happy to address them. One from earlier, being boring is not necessarily a negative trait for a president. Many people would want a steady hand on the tiller. I don't know, Murphy, if you want to speak to that at all.
God, I don't disagree. I don't disagree. We probably had that listed under negative traits, but no, I completely understand the interpretation. Yeah.
Though I do think it's part of Biden's fundamental challenge, right? Is like, how do you, boring does not, like literally by definition does not capture attention, right? So how do you effectively market boring? It's almost an oxymoron. I think it's, you know, it's part of the challenge for him.
Maybe we could put a positive spin on it. It's stable, predictable.
Right. none of which moves copy, right? None of which are good ways to get into the news media. So it's a significant challenge of like, you know, I'm the boring guy, vote for me. Well, if you ever hear from me, maybe. Any other questions? I don't see any yet. Anything else in the list?
Well, I think, Chris, we're kind of touching up on time here.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. As Ellen mentioned at the top, this recording will be made available. There's also a series of releases we're doing over the next couple of months, excerpting pieces of this, and we'll be pushing that out, and it'll be available to you. So you're welcome to examine that. And then Chris Murphy and I, of course, are always available if anyone has any questions for you to reach out. We're always happy to chat. Do see actually 2 questions just rolling in. We have did we ask who they'd vote for if the election was held today? And then another question, do we have data to compare to Obama as well? I don't know, Murphy, if you want to add those 2, answer those 2 before we break.
Yeah, we did not introduce either of the Obamas into or either of the adult Obamas into our political figure list, because at that point, there had been no declaration of interest in running, and still hasn't been on Michelle's part. I was telling Chris before we got on the call, I suspect if we'd included Michelle Obama in that favorite politician question, we might have gotten quite a different result. But no, we did not ask about that. And I'm sorry, what was the other question? Oh, the head-to-head election. Yes, we did ask about head-to-head scenarios. So if it was Trump Biden, if it was at that time, if it was Biden Haley, so yes, that data is available. Probably best captured on the remember the 34, 35, 30 slide.
Yeah, it's very close, and it's pretty much in alignment with what we see in other public polls. The one other teaser, though, is that we are probably going to be rolling this experiment out in the United Kingdom for their general election later this year. So we will be able to actually see how it performs in some other contexts. So stay tuned for that.
Thanks.
Right. Take care, everybody. Have a good day.